I have tested all of Trigger's teams, and instead of covering all of them half-assed, I picked the best 3 so we can cover them more in depth and focus on the pros and cons of Trigger in those teams in comparison to the other options. We will talk about Soldier Zero Anby, Miyabi and Hypercarry Yanagi in a mono-electric team, with a special mention to Evelyn, Nekomata and Jane. Not because Trigger is incredibly good in those last 3 teams, but because they deserve to be talked about for different reasons. If you are looking for Harumasa, you will not find him in this video. I am incredibly bad with Harumasa and hence do not think I am able to give you a fair assessment of his synergy with Trigger, which means I will instead leave you with these 3 YouTube channels instead who actually know what they are doing when playing this guy. If you're only interested in one specific team, timestamps are in the description and the timeline. I also recommend checking out my guide on Trigger if you haven't yet. Let's get started. As expected, Trigger is one of Soldier Zero's Anby's best teammates. Yes, you heard that right. One of, not the best. The reason here being, and you will notice this is gonna be a trend in every single team going forward, it depends on whether or not you have Trigger's signature weapon. Trigger without her signature performed about on the same level as Chingy or Neko for me, only slightly in favor of Trigger. In fact, her weapon is so good that I actually achieved a slightly higher score with Trigger's signature rather than Anby's. This is likely due to error in play, but I think it is interesting regardless. Anyway, I could continue yapping about my scores, but you have the table on screen right now, so pause if you need to. Let's instead talk about her pros and cons in comparison to other options. Generally speaking, Trigger pairs extremely well with other supports for Anby, mainly Neko, Caesar and of course ASTRA, and allows for a lot of heal time for Anby. While Chingy can achieve similar results to Trigger, playing with Trigger makes resource and stack management on Anby just a whole lot easier, while also allowing for enough field time and hence also decibel generation for Anby to have her ultimate ready for basically every single stun window. While Neko can in theory achieve higher scores than Trigger without her signature, managing Neko's uptime effectively is extremely difficult for most players and hence also much harder to achieve than Trigger jumping around in the background while you get all of her buffs for free while doing absolutely nothing with her. The real deal however is Trigger when actually paired with ASTRA. Because Death Shred works essentially the same way as pen ratio and the stun damage multiplier being a different multiplier as well, Trigger's buffs pair extremely well with other stat buffs not named pen ratio, and ASTRA provides a lot of them. Attack, crit damage and damage percent. Soldier Zero Anby and Trigger were made for each other, and that also shows in the gameplay. It is smooth and you don't really have to take care of anything in regards to Trigger, she really just mostly plays herself. Which means you can fully focus on Anby and whomever you choose as the third teammate. While Neko can in theory achieve similar scores to Trigger without her signature, she just falls behind the moment where Trigger does have her signature. I also do want to give a special mention to Trigger Rina however, not because they don't play well with each other, but because pen ratio and death shred are multiplicative with each other, which basically means they are anti-synergistic. On top of that, I just suck with Rina, so there's that. Double stun compositions work in theory, however I felt like for Anby specifically this team just had too much days. Chingy and Trigger just did not allow for enough time for Anby to actually gather resources before heading into the stun window, which overall just results in a big fat ass damage loss. While I usually like Lucy a lot, I felt her buff simply did not keep up with other options such as Nicole, Astra, Caesar or even Chingy. She still is pretty easy to play compared to the likes of Nicole, and maintaining her buffs is easy enough. Unfortunately, her M6 bars only drop on EX specials, and while we still use both triggers as well as Anby's EX special, there just aren't as many procs on it compared to other synergies like Piper or Bernie's. To summarize, if you have Trigger's signature, she will outperform most other options, and especially when paired with ASTRA. Without her signature, she performed similar to the likes of Jingyi or Nicole, with Nicole's performance depending a lot on your skill issues or the lack thereof. Generally speaking, she is really easy to play and a good addition for Anby teams. Yanagi Hypercarry within a more or less mono-electric team has actually been insanely fun, and Trigger works very nicely for this team as well. The by far highest score I achieved using Trigger and Nicole with Trigger's signature. Being able to spam Yanagi's EX went absolutely nuts in regards to the amount of ultimates I got, 6 per fight in fact. Using proper spacing and optimizing Nicole's uptime, I am sure this score is much lower than it could be, and you might be able to even squeeze out a 7th ultimate on her. Trigger in itself is very good in this team, simply because of how much field time she gives to Yanagi, which directly translates into a lot of EX specials and hence also ultimates, since her EX special generates around 350 to 400 decibel with each use. The team also felt just simply super satisfying to play, simply because of Yanagi's iframes as well as her interrupt resistances, and they probably have been the least frustrating corruption complex fights I have had in a while. The Jingyi Nicole team worked for Yanagi pretty well as well. It however was much less satisfying to play, and I often found myself in a situation where I had to decide on whether or not I am looking at taking the field with Yanagi to generate energy for the stun window, but essentially dealing no damage whatsoever, or I am taking the field with Jingyi to actually do something meaningful, but in exchange I will not have enough energy for the stun window. As it has been a trend by now, Trigger pairs super well with ASTRA and Nicole and also really likes her signature. This team is no exception, however there finally has been one team which has in fact been using Trigger's signature but performed worse than all of the other options. A double stun composition with Jingyi and Trigger has, just as it has been the case with Anby, very fun to play, but outside of that not performing on the same level as other variations. While the enemy basically doesn't get to move anymore, which to be fair is really fun, we are simply missing buffs to actually deal meaningful damage to make use of the 10 million stun windows we have now. Our all-time favorite steamroll any content team of Miyabi-Yanagi ASTRA has one problem. It wants ASTRA, but so does every team. So wouldn't it be nicer if Trigger could replace ASTRA in this team so ASTRA is free to join her bodyguard or anyone else for that matter? Fortunately, she can. Mind you, I don't actually think Trigger outperforms ASTRA even without her signature, but this is more likely the result simply due to error in play. However, Trigger can indeed keep up with ASTRA and Nicole as well. Playing with Trigger in this team grants one additional stun window we usually wouldn't have, which directly also results in 2 additional chain attacks for Miyabi, 1 more ultimate due to the now additionally generated decibel from said chain attacks, and lastly also 1 additional enhanced basic 3. All of that combined with the new additional stun damage multiplier can easily make up for ASTRA's buffs, especially if your Miyabi and Yanagi are well built. ASTRA's buffs generally have also diminishing returns as they are additive to your current stacks. However, Trigger's buffs are multiplicative with them, which means Trigger becomes better the better your units are built and vice versa. This is in fact true for basically all teams, but I wanted to mention it regardless. Personally, I don't think I prefer Trigger in this team in terms of playstyle, but even without her signature, Trigger can replace ASTRA or Nicole here, and that is a good thing. Evelyn also really likes Lighter, and she likes ASTRA. Like everybody. So the question arises, can we replace one of them? Can we possibly even take away the idol from the bodyguard? The answer is yes, somewhat. I do want to mention that I really hate playing Evelyn versus Pompey, and I cannot play Lighter super well either. Fortunately for me, Lighter, Eve and Pompey exist in both of the top teams, so if both scores suck, they can still be compared relatively to each other. And it turns out Trigger with her signature is actually pretty close to ASTRA. This is the one time where I think that a double stun composition can actually work out. However, I also did not 100% properly use the additional chain attacks given from ASTRA, which does diminish her value in this team for me personally a lot. I would argue the better you are with ASTRA and lighter, they will both be ahead by probably around 10 to 15% above any Trigger composition. At least as long as we only get fire enemies which are also resistant to electric. If Hoyo ever decides to remove the electric resistance from our fire weak endgame enemies, this team can actually become much better and closer to the top team. As per usual, without her signature, Trigger falls behind by a lot. Regardless if you have her signature or not, Trigger has a possible place in this team as well, even if it will not reach the same heights as lighter ASTRA will for Evelyn. Okay, we will keep this short, because frankly, as much as I love Nekomata, she just is not good. This is partially due to no fizz weak enemies as well, but she just gets outperformed heavily by the likes of Jane, Piper and probably even Corrin. I was just barely able to even 20k clear this fucking robot using Chingy and ASTRA, and did not manage to do so using Trigger without her signature and ASTRA. Funnily enough, using Trigger with her signature gave me at least 25k points. Oh, and this has been a mindscape to Nekomata, because frankly she is unplayable before that. Not literally, if you can just play Jane, Piper or even Corrin instead. And speaking of her counterparts, if you have Trigger signature, Trigger will even find herself a possible place within Anomaly and Disorder teams, getting close to the performance of ASTRA, even if slightly behind. However, the team would perform better if Pompey would just not resist electric, please. Thank you. Regardless of the performance, the team felt super nice to play and honestly very similar to the ASTRA one. While it is not the best option for neither Trigger nor Jane Bernice, it is an option. The same also applies to Corrin, Piper, Soldier 11 and technically even Ellen. Trigger is an option in all of those teams, and even if she is not the best possible option, as long as you have her signature, she will just perform well enough or even close to other available teammates you might or might not have. And don't forget, Corrin and Soldier 11 would even give Trigger her additional ability back, which non-Yanagi or non-Grace Anomaly teams are frankly lacking. To summarize the results, whether or not Trigger is an actual improvement over current teams will depend much more on her weapon choice rather than Trigger herself. Without her signature, she is barely an upgrade over the likes of Nicole, Caesar or Chingy for Soldier Zero Anby, albeit the team feels much nicer to play. The same can be said for Yanagi Hypercarry teams, where it will not perform much better than Chingy or Nicole currently do. She did however perform pretty well for Miyabi-Yanagi teams, even without her signature, but unfortunately does not become much of a replacement within other teams such as Evelyn. If you happen to have her signature however, not only can she be placed within any other team such as Evelyn or even Jane teams for that matter, but she will also be able to outperform ASTRA in Miyabi-Yanagi or Yanagi Hypercarry teams. For Soldier Zero Anby teams, Trigger pairs extremely well with ASTRA, but other choices such as Nicole, Lucy or Caesar work well with Trigger as well. And with that said, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more Zenless on Zero content, leave a comment on, I don't know, your favorite color, join the Discord and have a great day. Peace.